Hi, everyone. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Kelsey Bishop. She really believes that the true job satisfaction in tech comes when people can be themselves in an inclusive and accepting team. And in May 2021, she founded Candor and has raised $5 million in funding since. And this is a platform that users are given a chance to create job profiles with real, honest feedback that may result in better self-awareness, more growth, and greater fulfillment at work. Kelsey began her career as an employee in early stage startups, and she's led operations, partnerships, and business growth projects with teams that seemed magical, but she also collaborated with more challenging groups. Kelsey now feels lucky to contribute to a product that helps others make work their happy place. Again, welcome, Kelsey. So excited to dive in to our topic today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So understanding when it comes to your platform at Candor, is this considered formal feedback or informal feedback? Like, what can we expect when we sign up for Candor?
Yeah, so Candor is meant to be an authentic profile that really shows who you are at work. So
Mhm.
when you sign up for a Candor profile, you start by filling out something that we call takes. And it's just your take on how you work best, when you're most productive, what you value, what motivates you, all of these things that we generally learn about someone on a job like years into working with them, but actually like is really helpful information to kind of know when you're first meeting them.
Absolutely.
Um, So yeah, I mean, and the profiles also, so it's partly what you kind of say about your own work style, and then you can invite your teammates to contribute like, hey, what do you think I'm great at? Like, where do you think I shine on the team? So in the like Candor profile sense, feedback is much more like, hey, this is my reflection of kind of the way that you're filling up our team, the way that you're kind of like fitting in, aligning with our values, like that type of thing.
Definitely. I can see that this would really fit in with regards to like onboarding processes. So as people
Yes.
are joining teams, that would be an opportune time to have them share a little bit about themselves and even have some feelings of validation around the same as well.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly that. Most teams are using it for onboarding and particularly onboarding in a remote environment where you don't get to
Mm,
meet someone, where you're not having coffee with them on their first day on the job, that type of thing.
awesome. Awesome. And so platform aside, what actually got you to this point? Understanding that you have an extensive resume and background, all that great stuff, but what is your personal story that you woke up one morning and was like, the world is missing this thing?
Yeah, well, I woke up one morning after I left my last job and realized that I wasn't sure how to find a culture aligned team. And what that
Mm,
meant to me was like I was at a job where I didn't feel like I quite fit and I quite belonged with the team that I was on. And I didn't get the feedback that I was looking for. I'm a pretty like direct, open person. Maybe it's the New Jersey in me, but I just like I loved, being in workplaces in the past where I could just like ask a manager for feedback, ask a teammate for feedback, and really like get a sense of how I was doing. So that was a piece of it. I was on teams that didn't quite do that for me. I was also on teams that just didn't light me up.
mm,
And when I left my last job, I was like, how do I find that again? And I realized that there was actually no great way to find a team where you really belong on it, where
mm,
you really align with the culture. And so, yeah, I was like, I can't go get another job because there's this massive problem where I look at someone's LinkedIn and I have no idea who they are. And then I go through 8 rounds of interviews and I still have no idea who they are. And then I join a team, and 2 weeks in, I'm like, ooh, I don't know if this is the right fit. So that was kind of my personal experience, was like, culture alignment and like making sure you really feel like you belong on a team is so important to day-to-day happiness,
mm,
but
mm.
it's so hard to kind of get to the crux of that early on in kind of like a process with a company.
Yeah, yeah, I see that point, and it's extremely relevant today, especially in the remote workplace, right? And so knowing that this, well, to me, it sounds like this has been your passion project. What other aspects is Candor used for? So understanding that it's to get to know and as a real professional person. But is there multi-uses for it? Help me understand a little bit more. I did some digging on your website, but I'm curious to hear your story.
Yeah, so the initial use case is Candor's free for everybody. You can sign up and make an authentic work profile that actually shows who you are as a professional.
Mhm.
So what we hope in the future is everyone's using Candor instead of LinkedIn to really showcase who they are at work. Practically, what it's being used for today is remote teams are using it to get to know each other and strengthen their culture. So the second piece, kind of like strengthening their culture, part of that is like starting on the right foot with someone, right? Onboarding them well, getting to know them. But the other pieces are we actually help with celebrating each other. So we have a
Mhm.
mini product in Candor where we help remind you to give teammates shout outs based on how they're living your values. So we say, hey, give us your 5 values, your company values. And then once a week, we'll send everyone a reminder and say, hey, who gets your shout out for living one of your values this week?
Mhm.
So that's like
Mhm.
one of our micro products. We're actually about to launch a few more, one that's focused on feedback specifically. But the entire thesis behind Candor is that like culture should be small, intentional, fun moments that you have with teammates. And
Mhm.
I think for so long, and I'm sure you've seen this in your HR days, it's like HR was like made this like culture owner and it became this like very heavy processized thing
Mhm.
instead of something that's like light and organic and bottoms up. And so our entire kind of like model at Candor is like, how do we make culture more bottoms up and more organic and more fun?
Mhm. Mhm. I enjoy all of this because oftentimes, from my seat to your point, culture was a hard, big, onerous project in the sense of integratively tying mission value statements, making sure that we have things like a culture playbook, and then the work and best practices that go behind that as well. And I'm not taking away from those tools, but how they're utilized, I feel, should be expectations or guideposts, whereas the candor would be what they're actually doing. Like that's the walk versus
Yes,
the talk, right? Yeah.
exactly.
Mm,
Yeah. Yeah.
mm,
It's like not values on your website. It's how do you live your values every day? Right.
right.
And how do we celebrate that? How do we give feedback on that? It's the tactics, right? And I think that's the part of culture that is so hard and also something that a lot of people miss is they're like, well, let's get all the execs in a room to set values and like then we'll have better culture. But
Mhm.
actually it like requires a lot of tiny intentional moments every single day.
Absolutely, because what that does is it helps breed trust. And you're basically putting what I would call bids back and forth, right? So
Yeah.
if Ange is giving Kelsey, a kudo or a shout out based on a core value, Kelsey's like, oh, I haven't talked to Ange in like 2 weeks. That's really cool.
Yeah.
And, it's continued conversation in the sense of coming
Yes.
from a place of positivity versus oftentimes what can happen in workplaces is people are congealing or gelling around the problems, not
Yes.
the
Yeah.
successes so much. So I can really appreciate where you're coming in from. You mentioned something, you dropped a little seed here, and I want to pick at it, with regards to feedback. Tell me more. What's coming down the pipeline when it comes to feedback at Candor?
Yeah. So when we think about how a lot of orgs traditionally do feedback, it's like, okay, once a year, you're going to sit down with your manager and have this big, scary conversation that is going to impact how much you're paid and whether you still have a job.
Right.
Um, this is an awful way to do feedback. And I think it really comes down to like, what is the purpose of feedback in modern day orgs? And in my opinion, it's to help people grow and help people get better and
Mhm.
also help increase the self-awareness somebody has of their value within an organization.
Mhm.
And so to do those things, actually, we shouldn't sit down once a year. This should be something that we're doing continuously over time in non-stressful ways. So somebody can really hear the feedback and kind of internalize it. And so we're about to launch a part of our product that will help teams do this in a more, I think, nuanced way that's a little bit more aligned with a modern organization. And what we'll do is actually pair people with, you can basically invite a teammate for bi-directional feedback. That might happen on a monthly or quarterly basis, kind of depending on what works for you in this peer.
Mhm.
And you can kind of choose the questions that are asked. And both parties get a say in which questions are asked. And so it comes down to like it's not a manager giving you feedback and it's like this heavy, stressful moment. It's, hey, two people who really care about each other's success and each other's growth, we're going to give each other feedback on this regular cadence, for the sake of feedback, not for the sake of comp, not for the sake of, this annual process. So yeah, that's going to be our feedback product that we're launching.
That's really interesting. And a few things are coming up for me. Parking lotting for a second, that you may have alluded that LinkedIn is one of your biggest direct competitors. I want to unpack that. But firstly, speaking to what you just said, what I'm hearing is this isn't going to necessarily replace performance reviews, quote unquote, but rather it's an enhancement in the sense of experiential peer-to-peer feedback. And what was coming up for me was a bit of the cynic side. So what happens, or how do you set the context so that it comes to that place of greater good? Because everything that you're explaining to me, I'm like, oh my God, the skies are opening up when it comes to feedback. I think that's beautiful and very eloquently put. However, we know that there can be nuances when we're looking at feedback because we're dealing with humans. It's a human to human interaction, right? And Ange may be in a really poor mood one day and she's supposed to be giving Kelsey feedback. So how do you set your users up for success in really staying true to the cadence and or the proper operation of what Candor is standing for around feedback?
Yeah, I think a lot of this does come down to like knowing the intention behind like the whole exercise. Um, and making sure that users know like it's not something that's forced. The entire premise of Candor is like this is something that is like co-authored and collaborative. It's not like your manager telling you, hey, like we have to do this feedback thing. It's really like something that you opt into. And I
Yes,
think even that, like changing the power dynamics around feedback changes the entire thing completely, right? Because
I
it's not
see.
like, oh, I'm in a bad mood and I'm being forced to give feedback again. It's like, hey, like my manager cares about me and I care about them. And we're doing this together for each other. And I think that feels very different.
I can see that for sure. And so when you're thinking about feedback, how does that directly impact performance? Because I guess what I'm trying to get at is digging a little bit deeper. What is Candor's objective of the feedback piece, if not to replace performance reviews?
Oh yeah, I think we should replace performance reviews. Yeah. I think that's kind of like I think that's in theory that would be the power of doing feedback on like a
Mm,
weekly, monthly, quarterly cadence is actually there's no reason to do annual performance reviews. There's a reason maybe to reevaluate comp annually. There's a reason to reevaluate like role, title, etc. annually. But to give feedback on an annual basis would basically be like grabbing summaries of like the quarterly feedback meetings, which makes way more sense to me than like kind of keeping this annual feedback practice.
absolutely, absolutely. And so, how do you speak to the audience out there that needs a little bit more of a push to think through the systematic approach to performance reviews to more of an organic feel of feedback? So specifically what I'm getting at is oftentimes with performance reviews, goals or objectives or OKRs are tied to those things. Are those now forgotten in the sense of feedback, or are those embedded somewheres or promoted within the types of conversations that you would have across your platform?
Yeah, I mean, the only fundamental thing that we'd be changing is like the cadence and the power dynamic, right? So like
Fair.
feedback's bi-directional instead of one directional. So yeah, in terms of like OKRs goals, like of course, like we still want to make feedback feel concrete and like tied
Mm,
to something greater.
mm.
Um, but yeah, the proposal here is like could you actually just like lessen the strain on your team every single December before people break for the holidays or every single January? Because I think in reality, people are taking hours and hours of time to do these annual reviews. And feedback doesn't actually have to be that heavy. And I think it would take people less time if you were doing it every quarter because it wouldn't be like, oh, let me think about how Kelsey's performed for the whole year. And this is so serious and so much is on the line. And I better be really careful with my words.
Right.
Whereas if you're doing this on like a shorter cadence, it's like the feedback is fresh. It's also lower pressure. Like it's going to take people less time.
Definitely. And so what I'm hearing is that there's an opportunity for peer-to-peer feedback, but also, the manager and the team member giving each other feedback as well.
Oh,
Just to be
yes. Oh,
clear.
yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
definitely.
Yeah.
I can't agree more too. Like, I despised annual performance reviews because not only was it about an administrative time crunch, it often felt like I was checking boxes. And
Yeah.
then I
Yeah.
had to put people in a scoring box. And, when things happen like a pandemic or an economic downturn or something out of their control, there wasn't a box to explain that except for other,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I can certainly appreciate where you're coming from in your thought process around this. And it's exciting too, because that saves a lot of time and has positive impacts to the bottom line, hopefully, because what I see trickle out from performance conversations or feedback conversations that work or are working for team members is there's higher levels of engagement. There's
Yes.
lower levels of absenteeism, lower levels of turnover, which all impacts the bottom line. The other thing that I'm kind of thinking about is you said something really interesting earlier where it was like, it's not something that's forced. People organically want to do it because they have the mindset of helping each other out by way of feedback. How do you, how do you elevate that thought process to organizations who are very much used to currently using structures?
Yeah. Like more hierarchical structures. Yeah. Um, so I do think that it requires it requires a lot of leadership buy-in. That's actually what it comes down to is if your leaders are bought in on, hey, there's a better way to do this, there's a better way to incentivize people, there's a better way to motivate people, then I think
Yeah.
actually you can make the jump from like a more hierarchical structure to one that feels a little bit more flat and peer-to-peer. I think if your leadership's not bought in, it is going to be super difficult. And I haven't found like a
Absolutely.
great answer for that yet, other than like maybe you should leave the company.
I can't endorse that piece, but I hear you.
um, but yeah, I think I think you have to get your leaders bought in, and then it becomes like very clear to most leaders that like I think most leaders are open-minded to something that feels less hierarchical. But you get into this conversation of like extrinsic versus intrinsic motivators for your employees. And I think what's really interesting is so many hierarchical companies look at extrinsic motivators and they're like,
Absolutely.
okay, we need to pay people more. We need to give them bonuses. Like we need to like keep them on this hamster wheel so that they keep working hard for us. And what happens is like 2 years in, the employee is like, this is BS. Like I'm on a hamster wheel and I don't want to do this anymore. And those extrinsic motivators get old really fast and people leave. And what happens in kind of the more flat organizations and with leaders who are open to non-hierarchical structures is you get more into the employees' intrinsic motivations. You get into this sense of, wow, can we actually help people feel like they belong here? Can we give them a greater sense of purpose? Can we, make them care about our values and having behaviors that align with these values? And that feels very different when you think about like employee retention and loyalty and all of these things that leaders do care about.
Absolutely. And sorry, Kelsey, just taking a pause there, differentiating between extrinsic and intrinsic motivators, extrinsic being things like pay, bonuses, gift cards, pizza
Yep.
days, food book, like travel, et cetera, et cetera. When you say those get old fast, it's because it's like a short-term reward. And then afterwards,
Yeah.
it feels like entitlement. Whereas intrinsic motivators are things that are positively pushing or impacting upon our values, what gets us up or fired up in the morning, and it's longer lasting. It takes longer to build. And I think where a large gap that you're fulfilling from the place of Candor, Kelsey, is that oftentimes leaders aren't sure how to tap into those intrinsic motivators. And this is something that simplifies it. Like, it's like, those books, how to do blah, blah, blah for dummies. Like, I feel like, I don't like that word, but I feel like,
Yes, no, but that's
Candor
it.
is
We call
that.
it putting it on autopilot, like putting
Right.
culture on autopilot.
Yes.
Culture for dummies. Yeah.
Yes. Very well
Yeah.
put.
Yeah.
Definitely. And so when you're thinking about the platform as a whole, let's go back to this LinkedIn thing. Help me
Yeah.
understand how you're going to give LinkedIn a run for their money.
Yeah. So what's interesting is LinkedIn's entire model is, hey, we're going to give you this profile that modernizes your resume, right? Your
Yeah.
resume is in a PDF doc that nobody sees. How about you put your resume online, and in change you'll get jobs. What's broken about that model is that means you're fundamentally getting a job based on your resume.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not getting a job based on who you are and what you bring to the table, because
Mm-hmm.
the resume is super one dimensional. So to give me a job based on a job title that I previously had, it misses the whole point, right? Like you miss a human is very complex as,
Right.
as a professional. And so just to base it off of, what company that I was at or what job title I had, it's a really antiquated way of hiring.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I think what we could do at Candor is actually have these profiles that show who you really are as a human, what you care about, what you're good at, and then match you to culture aligned teams or culture aligned managers who see that and can respect that and actually like really jive with that.
Absolutely.
Because I think what we see is like people don't leave jobs, they leave managers, and vice versa. People
Mm-hmm.
like don't stay because of their title. They stay because they love the people that they're working with.
Absolutely. And I can envision that there's future opportunities where you could embed things like DISC models and emotional intelligence
Oh, yes.
assessments
Yeah.
so that when you're going through those pieces and looking at that whole person, you have both the task oriented, so the evidence stuff, as well as the
Yes.
human centric that's tied in a nice little neat bow. Of course, we're not going to know everybody fully until we get curious
Totally.
and get embedded into those roles, but agreeing that it gives a better snapshot as to
Yeah.
not just who we're hiring, but to people that are applying for different jobs, how they fit within that role, because it has to be a two-way conversation and a win-win situation.
Yeah, exactly. And we actually, I'm super against interviews as a concept. I think it's a really silly way of hiring. And so one method I'm super excited about that we do is called the mutual assessment. It's basically a 2-week work trial where you pay someone to come on and do the job
Mhm.
that they're interviewing to do. And we found it works really well. We'll see what it feels like at scale, but at least for now, it's just like there's some really interesting like I think progressions that we're seeing in the hiring space, whether it's like mutual assessment or other ways of hiring that aren't just interviews,
Yeah,
that I
yeah.
think we'll start to see more of when it comes to evaluating someone's skill set.
I find that really interesting. Help me understand. So, like, let's just say there's 80 people that are interested in doing this 2-week mutual assessment. How does
Yeah.
that work? Like, how do you get it down to that one person? I'm trying to wrap my
Yeah.
head around
So I haven't done 80 mutual assessments consecutively yet,
it.
thankfully. um, there is, so to be clear, I think interviewing by itself is a really bad way of hiring, but I
Okay.
do like one kind of like culture alignment check before we move into a mutual assessment.
Okay.
And generally it's just a 30-minute call with me or someone else in the team. And we'll just kind of like ask a couple questions that are based on our cultural values. So like, for
Right.
example, one of our cultural values is like personal growth is professional growth.
Mm-hmm.
And so one question I love to ask is like, what are you trying to grow in personally and what are you trying to grow in professionally at the moment? Just to get a sense of like someone's orientation towards growing.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll do kind of like a 30-minute chat. And from there, we'll kind of see like, okay, does this feel like enough of a fit from this 30-minute chat to move forward with a 2-week trial? We have run trials consecutively, and I think transparency is the most important thing in these things. Like, it's a mutual assessment, right? You're coming in to see if this job is the right job for you.
Right.
There are other candidates that are doing exactly the same thing. And so I think like being transparent about what's going on, like no one can fault you kind of for that if they're completely on the same page and know exactly what they're opting into. And the other piece of this is like they're getting paid, right? And that's also different from like a normal interview process that you're going through
Absolutely.
as 80 other candidates are going through.
Agreed.
But in this one, you're getting paid. So that also I think takes maybe like the edge or the pressure off. It's kind of like, well, I'm a consultant for the next 2 weeks. We'll see how it goes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so enjoying where you're going with this because it's almost breaking the landscape of recruitment, which I'm really intrigued by. So again, my HR brain stepping in, because normally what happens, we know that there's a job posting, well, job description to start behind the scenes, but job posting, then we go through the regular recruitment process, right? So there's pre-screening, then
Yep.
there's or knock-out questions, pre-screening, interviews. Sometimes there's tests or behavioral questions. Then there might be a second interview or maybe a case scenario, depending on how challenging that competition was, reference checks, background checks, et cetera, et cetera. So can you walk me through the how-to? Because I'm hearing snippets and my interest is extremely piqued, because what I'm hearing is you're basically throwing out the majority of that process. You might keep some of those good parts, like the job posting piece. But from there, it almost seems like then it goes into a duality conversation. So, hearing you in the sense that first step would be kind of a cultural alignment conversation for 30 minutes, to see if further trials are needed with that individual, and then potentially some behavioral testing. So from there, how would we work with Candor to go like from start to finish in that process?
Yeah. So actually, this is not something Candor productizes today. It's just something that like we do internally as our process, but it is something that I would love our product to help teams do eventually, because I
You
do
need
think that like
to.
this mutual
Absolutely.
assessment thing is I don't know. I think it's the only way I'll ever hire again, to be honest. And
Mm-hmm.
I've talked to a lot of founder friends about it, and it truly is, I think, the best way to hire someone in like a high confidence way. Like
Right.
you don't want to get to the end of an interview process, either as a candidate or as a company, and just like kind of be like, oh, I'm not sure. Like it's the only candidate or it's the only company I got an offer at. Like that's an awful place to be in. And
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't it be amazing if you could get to the end of a process and be like, I know exactly what my day to day is going to be like, and I'm stoked about it. Like I can't wait to start. And that's what you get at the end of a mutual assessment.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's something we do kind of like hacky today, and internally we have a lot of processes around it. And yeah, one day the Candor product will hopefully guide people through how to do this.
Absolutely. You need to continue to catch up with us here at the Human Side of Business
Yeah.
podcast and let us know the outcomes. That's exciting stuff. So dialing back into the feedback piece a little bit further, at what point do you take the feedback from online to offline? So like
Yeah.
how do you work with Candor to ensure that you're utilizing the right, not the right, but the right moments, and I guess choices of communication? Because sometimes we know
Yeah.
that a Zoom call suffice, but other times it's in person, and sometimes it could be that quick Slack or Candor note.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it really comes down to like, what are your teammates' preferences? And I think
Mm,
before it was kind of this black box of, well, I don't know how Kelsey likes to get feedback. But actually, like, this is something on my Candor profile. Like, I write how I like to get feedback on my Candor profile. So I think it depends on the teammate that you're working with, right? Like, if I say I like to get feedback one on one in person, great, you know that about me. And if it's like, hey, I actually like enjoy time to process feedback because I'm a super sensitive person. This is true in my case. And I love to like be able to absorb the feedback before immediately needing to respond to it. So actually like written feedback is amazing. So I think you kind of have to go teammate by teammate, and like knowing their preferences is step one. And then step two is like, okay, do we do this in person now? Do we do this on Candor? Do we do this somewhere else? But yeah.
And what would you say to a rules-based or operationally focused leader to get them on board with Candor?
Um, I think it comes down to like getting real about what it's going to take to attract talent in the next wave
Mhm.
of work. I think in today's age, now more than ever, people have optionality. They
Yes.
can go be a consultant, they can work wherever they want, they can get like 17 jobs, and it doesn't matter because in this remote world, and also I think with the rise of like contracting and freelancing,
Yes.
people really have options, like just so many options.
Mhm.
And if you want to be able to attract talent, you need to be an amazing workplace. it's a huge ask to get someone to join you full time on your company. Especially if you're a startup, you're not like the sexiest company in the entire world to go work for. It takes a lot for someone to take a bet on you. And so I would say, like, if you're trying to compete with today's world of work and trying to attract the best talent you possibly can, you need to be the best workplace that you possibly can.
Amazing. And so what I'm hearing, kind of taking it a step further, if I may, pull me out of left field if I'm going there, Kelsey, but what I'm hearing is, if I'm that kind of go-getter operational person that's very task orientated, thinking about using something like Candor from a human-centric approach really is going to be a cost or risk mitigator when it comes to, again, going back to retention, not just getting the right people in the right jobs, but also keeping those people and being able to ensure that you have the proper successors that are coming up within your organization as well. That's kind of what I was gleaning throughout the conversation, what you just said.
Yeah. And what we see a lot is we have these like tactical operators come in and they come to Candor and they're like, I just had to lay off my 2 co-founders. What the heck do I do? Everyone's going to quit. And it's in those moments that like these operational tactics types see like how bad it can get, and also like the fact that you really need to do something for this. And I would say every single company goes through these moments, right? You have a layoff, you have to let go of a co-founder, huge part of your team leaves, like whatever it is, you go through all of it, right? As a leader, especially in startups. So I would say it's only a matter of time before it happens to you. And when it does, you realize the pain of not investing in kind of a more people-oriented approach.
And I genuinely wish that there was more of a way to elevate leaders and key stakeholders before the pain point to things like this.
Yes.
But I guess we're not going to build Rome in one day, right?
Yeah. It's a bell curve, right? You have the early adopters who just like understand that people are your biggest asset in a company. And then you have the majority, which is like, yes, they're important, but like business. And then you have the laggards, the late adopters, who are just, they're interested in the business, and they're not gonna orient towards people until it hits them in the face.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. So Kelsey, tell us, how do we sign up for Candor?
Yeah, you can sign up at joincandor.com, joincandor.com. It's totally free to sign up, free to make a profile, invite your teammates, and start getting to know each other.
That's amazing. And if we want to stay in touch with you, how do we reach out?
You can actually follow me on Candor. So you can follow my Candor profile. And I'm also available at kelsey@joincandor.com.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time and expertise today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is fun.